Hello, I'm Cameron Bailey, Artistic Director and co-head at TIFF. Welcome to this Images Matter conversation about how anti-Asian imagery has circulated in Hollywood movies, with special guests Professor Nancy Wang Yuen and Professor Elaine Chang. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to reflect on where we are. Here in Toronto, we are located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. These lands are protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and are home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful to be working on this land, and we encourage you to reflect on the land where you're located as well. I want to thank the people and the organizations that make everything we do at TIFF possible, our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oréal Paris, and Visa, and the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. Over the past year, we have seen a staggering rise in anti-Asian violence, verbal abuse, spitting, and beatings on the street, murders. As an organization devoted to the transformative power of film, we have to acknowledge the role movies have played in feeding anti-Asian racism. Yellow-faced performances and caricatured portrayals of Asians have persisted on screen since the very beginning of Hollywood cinema, demeaning and dehumanizing generations of viewers. Asian stories and characters are frequently whitewashed by Hollywood. Asian Americans have been erased from American cinema for so long, the generations have been raised with a distorted picture of that nation, where Asians are absent, marginalized, or perpetual new arrivals. But if film can seed hate, it can also nurture resistance to racism. Our Images Matter conversations consider the representation of racialized communities on screen and how the circulation of these images within film and media have shaped viewers' perspectives. Today, we're looking at anti-Asian racism within Hollywood cinema. To lead this conversation, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Elaine Chang and Dr. Nancy Wang Yuen. A Gyalpo daughter of Korean immigrants, University of Guelph professor Elaine Chang earned her BA from the University of British Columbia and her MA and PhD from Stanford University. Her publications include Real Asian, Asian Canada on Screen, and essays on topics including Asian North American mystery fiction and film for a forthcoming Modern Language Association volume. An alumna of the Canadian Film Centre's Screenwriters Lab, Dr. Chang has several feature screenplays in development. And Dr. Nancy Wang Yuen is a sociologist and pop culture expert. She's the author of Real Inequality, Hollywood Actors and Racism, and co-author of Tokens on the Small Screen, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Primetime and Streaming Television. She's spoken widely in the media, including on PBS, NPR, BBC World, and for the New York Times, and she's a guest writer at Newsweek, Elle, HuffPost, and Self. Dr. Yuen, Dr. Chang, thank you both for joining us. Dr. Yuen, Nancy, I want to start with you. Hollywood movies have long been one of the world's most persuasive forces in shaping how we think. And as Hollywood was starting out at the beginning of the 20th century, how were those films shaping how audiences thought about Asian people?
So the very first images of Asians were actually not portrayed by Asians. They were portrayed by white actors. So very much this kind of lens through the Western actor, director, writer. And so it wasn't authentic at all. And the very first one I'm thinking is this Madame Butterfly. It was a silent film with Mary Pickford. And it was in the early 1900s or 1910s. And so it was a film that was very much the kind of Orientalism. The Asian woman is seen as servile, and we know the story of Madame Butterfly, which comes from Puccini's opera in the late 1800s, where the Asian woman is wooed and by a white man, and then at the end gives birth to a child, and at the end kills herself. Right. So this is kind of it sets the tone of how Asian women are portrayed, and then of course the Fu Manchus, the Yellow Peril violent villain. And that very much was how Asian men were portrayed, and again in Yellowface. And so many of these movies were very, very popular, and those tropes still stay with us to this day.
Mm-hmm. Just to be very clear, because you mentioned yellowface, why would white actors be portraying Asian characters in early Hollywood movies? Why wouldn't Asian actors be playing those roles?
I think that Hollywood was very much that they just had white actors portraying everything. And this comes out of actually a tradition of minstrelsy as well. So minstrelsy were these plays, these live performances that were happening in the 1800s, very, very popular. And so that tradition was white actors playing African Americans, Native Americans, Latinx and Asian Americans. And they did so in a way that was very much, making fun of buffoonery. And also a lot of them were actually white ethnics. So at that time in US history, they weren't exactly seen as white. They were second-class citizens, a lot of them. And so actually an interesting kind of book that described this saw minstrelsy as a way for white ethnics to become white by portraying these others, these racial others, as those are truly non-whites. And then when they take off the makeup, we are more like you. So this very kind of cultural performance really had a racial work in society.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Chang, Elaine, I wanted to ask you about something that Nancy raised earlier, which is how gendered these representations were, whether they were yellowface performances by white actors or by Asian actors. The gendered part of the Asian stereotypes were built in right at the very beginning. Can you talk a little bit about how Asian women and Asian men were stereotyped? And we have a couple of very famous actors from that time, Anime Wang, and also Sesue Hayakawa, who were big stars at the time, but really constrained by the kind of roles they were allowed to play.
Absolutely. And interestingly, though, both performers were able to carve out careers in which they had some autonomy by playing to some of the types. Sesue Hayakawa had his own studio, but he often continued to play the duplicitous Asian man and what we see in a lot of these early gendered and racialized tropes are dichotomies where a woman would be virginal and innocent, but still sexually available, as is the case with Madame Butterfly, or scheming and conniving, uses her sexuality as a weapon. So you call it the Lotus Blossom Dragon Lady dichotomy. And for men, it was also sort of an impossible dichotomy because they were often emasculated from the early days of cinema. Nell Shipman, who was a really big star in 1919, produced and starred in a film called Back to God's Country and has a really small part for a Chinese man who's come to God's country as part of the gold rush, which is how many Chinese immigrants called, North America Gold Mountain, because that was one of the first waves of immigration. But they show a sort of burly French Canadian trapper cutting off this man's queue or braid in the back, and then also being violent. And critics have pointed out that very small scene is one of simultaneous deracination, cultural deracination, and emasculation, or it's a kind of symbolic castration. So a lot of the gendered stereotypes for Asian men from the early days, and we can trace the trajectories through to the present. You'll have the sort of emasculated houseboy who giggles a lot. So the emasculated houseboy who can be trusted, but then often shows some duplicity. They're the spy or the criminal or the white slaver, but the white slaver is the flip side to that. So it's as though Asian men were near sexuality, but not really partaking in it. It was sort of even more sinister. And that might have had a lot to do with when Chinese male workers, part of the so-called bachelor generation, came to the United States and Canada to work on railroads for less pay than other workers and given the most dangerous jobs, they not only had to pay exorbitant fees, head taxes, but they were not permitted to bring women with them or often marry. There were lots of very exclusionary and segregationist policies concerning whether white women could work with Chinese men. So, and again, it was sort of this idea that almost as though Asian men could spawn by themselves, that like vermin of a kind, but they were also threats to the purity of white women.
The interesting about Sessue Hayakawa is that he was actually very sexually portrayed as desirable. And even if he was seen as taboo. And so what Elaine said about kind of the dichotomy was, and this brutality that Sessue Hayakawa, I think in The Cheat, he actually branded his white female co-star, but it had, I think, the effect that you don't necessarily expect on audiences, that in fact, he became this matinee idol and very, very famous, on par with Rudolph Valentino and, Charlie Chaplin. And so he would draw, loads of women who wanted to see him and were very attracted to him as this kind of exotic, forbidden Asian man. And so that was very interesting. I feel like for the longest time, Sessue Hayakawa was more virile than like all the Asian male portrayals that followed him, until maybe even recently, when Asian men, I think, are seen maybe with Crazy Rich Asians as kind of romantic leads. Although Sessue Hayakawa was never a romantic lead because he never got together with anyone because of all the laws that were happening at the time.
He was the villain, but he was sexualized.
Yes, he was villain. He was a sexualized villain, and it was this kind of him and white women, right? So he was seen as a threat, but the audiences actually, I think, saw him as attractive because of that kind of forbidden portrayal.
Okay.
Could I say a little bit more about Sessue Hayakawa as well? Like, I'm so glad we're talking about him, such a very, very important figure. And I hope somebody does a biopic about him sometime soon. But I think he's also a matinee idol because of how his image and the kinds of stories he was inscribed in had so much cachet in Hollywood celebrity culture. And he had these wild parties that would be attended by stars like Clara Bow, and there'd be stories about her stripping and skinny dipping in Sessue Hayakawa's swimming pool. So he is sort of an outlier at the same time and I think that's exactly what Nancy is describing, an outlier and taboo at the same time, that he is this erotic object and is sort of ascribed limited, but still some erotic autonomy, which is very interesting.
Nancy, Elaine mentioned the head tax, and of course, all of these representations in early Hollywood cinema were reflections in a way, and in some cases used to exacerbate some of what was actually going on in the real world in terms of, say, America's geopolitical actions around the world. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, the World War II targeting of Japan and Japanese Americans, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of those kinds of things affected how Hollywood movies portrayed Asian people.
Yeah, so much of Hollywood representations of Asians follow their occupation of those countries or wartime, relations with those countries. So we think about even the very first Academy Award winner was Miyoshi Umeki, and that was coming out of a film called Sayonara that was about war, and she was essentially a war bride. It took place in Japan, but the kind of relations and depictions, kind of, you can see the tracing of when there's war and then there's representation in corresponding. And of course, there was propaganda too, right? There's this famous Bugs Bunny cartoon where it's like Bugs Bunny, I think, gets the the JAPS. And so it was a very offensive, it depicted Japanese in cartoon form, very much like animals, right? And so these kind of films very much are justifying the wars with Asia. And of course, in these films, you know, the United States and usually white Americans are portrayed as heroes.
Mm-hmm. Elaine, World War II really was a flashpoint in terms of representation of Asian people and some very virulent anti-Japanese propaganda that helped, I think, bolster the internment of Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans. But there were propaganda films that were being made in both Hollywood and here in Canada. Can you talk a little bit about that representation?
Yes, and it's the whole culture of images at large with insulting cartoons that have the sort of stereotypical features ascribed to the Japanese soldier, a very thick glasses, myopia, slanted eyes, buck teeth, and those remain staples of anti-Asian, anti-Japanese racism for a long time. But the National Film Board of Canada in 1945 produced a documentary, which is very thinly disguised anti-Japanese propaganda and pro-internment propaganda called Of Japanese Descent. And you have a disembodied voiceover narrator who's, you know, doesn't figure in, it's the voice of God. And you see image after image of the Japanese being so lucky to be in these camps that are protecting them in this very paternalistic way from things like typhoid. They credit themselves for curing them or saving them, and they show images of ransacked Japanese fishing communities, their homes, as if this is how they lived before. We help them clean up their act. And look at them, they're learning skills, logging and milling, and they put on their own shows. And it created this picture of we're doing it for their own good. And it's kind of paternalism that's also a huge feature of anti-Asian racism in film. And the very fact that, you know, the NFB was also responsible earlier for creating an image of Canada as the place you want to be if you're the white right kind of settler invader to Canada, and look at these beautiful vistas, and you know, had ethnically cleansed Indigenous people out of these gorgeous landscapes. So it's sort of part of this whole national, I hesitate to call it a strategy, but a practice of representation within the medium of documentary film that legitimated all kinds of actions, economic, military, political.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's quite disturbing. If you ever get a chance to see it, I think it's usually available on YouTube, Of Japanese Descent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was not the only propaganda film made by the NFB during the war as well. There was another one called Mask of Nippon. Nancy, I want to see if we can distinguish a little bit among the different sort of elements of racist representation that happened in Hollywood cinema, especially. We know, for instance, that the Western as a genre was very much built on the eradication of Indigenous Americans, Native Americans. Anti-Black racism was a part of Hollywood cinema from the very beginning. Even before there was a Hollywood, there was anti-Black racism. But anti-Asian racism is distinct. There are some similarities, but some very important distinctions. Can you maybe just trace those distinctions for us?
It's a hard question because I think we're trying to figure that out. I mean, Asian American scholars have been working on this, but I think we're grappling with that right now. The United States, I think, doesn't quite understand what anti-Asian racism is. Mm-hmm. And just for example, the Atlanta shootings, we have, you know, where 8 people were killed and 6 of them were Asian women, that they deemed it not a hate crime because the mass murderer said that Asian women, they were just temptations, right? And so this kind of intersectional, and this certainly is true for all groups, that there are different intersectional identities that in terms of racialized sexism or sexualized racism that Asian women in particular has experienced. And a lot of that has to do with, we can trace that back to the Page Act, right, which was in the 1800s. This predated the Chinese exclusion law. I'm sorry, 1800s, 1851, I believe. No, sorry. I'm like, I should look it up. Apologies. And so
1875.
1875, thank you.
You're welcome.
1875, and then 1882 was the Chinese exclusion. Yes. So the Page Act, and this actually is interestingly kind of goes into the Bachelor Society as well, right? In terms of the Page Act actually excluded Chinese women from coming to the United States altogether on the premise that they're all prostitutes. That was what the law actually stated. And it even stated that, they would be temptations for white men. I mean, this was a literal stereotype that existed all the way in the 1800s. And this predated the Chinese Exclusion Act and also, prevented Asian women from immigrating. And so if we take that and then you kind of go to what we've been talking about in terms of wars, where there are sex workers, right? There were also the comfort women, right, that were kidnapped by the Japanese National Army from various places in Asia. And then when the war was over, they actually transferred those women to the U.S. Army. And then these camp towns popped up, and that are still in existence today, where these towns pop up near U.S. military bases. And the predominant economic kind of driving force is sex work. Right. So Asian women are not any more likely to be sex workers than any other population. But in the U.S. imagination, so this is, with the history of U.S., military occupancy. And then, of course, then Hollywood comes along and portrays Asian women only as sex workers, only in these ways. Then it reifies those early, Lotus Blossom and Dragon Lady that Elaine mentioned, the very much this hypersexualization and fetishization and all that. It just kind of, rolls into one and continues to portray and I think in the popular imagination, and the way that, Asian women are conceptualized and dehumanized and, victimized, especially in this uptick of anti-Asian racism, since the pandemic. And so all of that plays together, and it's very disturbing as an Asian woman to know this about Hollywood, to have watched this, to have grown up and, in this culture, and yet knowing that we are so much more than what Hollywood portrays us as.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you both about how central racism has been to Hollywood cinema, the Hollywood cinema that, most of us consume and love, that we embrace. We live with these movies, we live with these images in our heads and these characters. But in the same way that a film like The Birth of a Nation was groundbreaking in some ways at its time, and certainly hugely popular, and had racism right at its core, and Gone with the Wind in 1939, again, still the most popular film that's ever been made in terms of the actual number of people who saw it and the amount of dollars it brought in. Again, with racism at its core, there's a couple of films that are much beloved that I wanted to talk a little bit about, and we have stills I want to look at. First, from Breakfast at Tiffany's, the great Audrey Hepburn in this film, which I know is a kind of a classic, considered a classic in many ways, but has just a virulently racist portrayal at its center, a Japanese man landlord played by Mickey Rooney, again, yellow-faced. Can we talk a little bit about that one? And then there's another one I wanted to address as well.
If I could back up, I think you asked a really important question, Cameron, and it's how deeply embedded or even inaugurating is racism to the whole Hollywood project from the very, very beginning. And D.W. Griffith also directed a movie called Broken Blossoms that was yellow-face, a white actor played, again, this desexualized Asian man who just wants to spread peace and his Buddhist beliefs in the US, but he gets mistaken for a white slaver, and he saves this young girl played by Lillian Gish from her abusive alcoholic father, but she ends up being killed. He ends up being blamed, and he ends up committing suicide. So we have the Madame Butterfly trope again. Like, what else can you do to preserve your honor as an Asian after? But first of all, the idea is it's to be expected that you'd be unjustly accused, because it's sort of accepted on the flip side that these are predilections in the Asian character for men to be morally depraved. Mr. Yunioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's falls right into that because he's a photographer. He seems a little leering and lascivious, but there's this aspect of an antiseptic, that he's not a legitimate sexual actor, even though he wants to take pictures of Holly Golightly. So, all of these things, you wonder if it all does foster this idea that, I don't know if Nancy, you found this, but I find that a lot of the confusion about what happened in Atlanta and this inability to sort of grasp in the dominant culture that to be an Asian woman is to experience racism as hypersexualization at the same time, and why those two things cannot compute. But I think that I've been hearing more that that when Asians are reporting instances of violence or racist harassment, that they're often met by impatience or even anger by law enforcement. And that I find, I've been trying to think about whether these Hollywood images sort of play a part in that. The idea that if Asians are, misjudged to be white slavers, that in a way they have to accept that it's just part of the natural world. And I was thinking about something else, like in a way, a lot of white images and all the things that Nancy talked about count towns and how after the Korean War and after all of these wars, so many displaced, widowed, impoverished Asian women have had to be conscripted into prostitution, but at no more of a rate than they would be in Europe. But interestingly, the American male in a movie like Sayonara comes off as the hero who saves the woman from the bad folk who would take advantage of her or destroy her innocence. And that occurs again and again, where the white hero gets exonerated for precisely what American soldiers and GIs actually did. So that is a trope of so many American war movies where the GI is the one who saves the poor woman with no place left to go or nowhere to turn. And at the same time that she delivers this image of the ideal submissive wife, unlike, white American women who might have some, dangerous ideas about their place in the society. But, if I'm sorry if I'm leaping ahead, but the imbrication of war into the whole Hollywood image repertoire is so strong that by the time you get to The Karate Kid in 1984, you have this here, Miyagi, the mentor figure, who is a widower because his wife and child died during childbirth of influenza in the Manzanar Relocation Center, which is an internment camp. But meanwhile, he was doing the right thing by serving in a very decorated 442nd All-Japanese American Regiment. But it's presented as a tragedy, just a loss that his wife and child had to die. And again, the Americans are taking care of their Japanese all along, like they take care of everyone else. But it's Miyagi gets to be distilled as the model minority because he engages in military on the right side. That's part of his history. He's sort of sympathetic figure because he's lost his family. He, of course, tutors Ralph Macchio to become the Karate Kid and a champion, but it's never, ever threatening to American military or economic interests. For me,
Nancy, I wanted to pick up on that, and I will get to some of the films that are drawing on America's wartime actions in Asia in a moment. But I wanted to go back to Breakfast at Tiffany's just for a moment and to ask you, because we've certainly faced this as a film institution. We have a Cinematheque. We present films like this. We have presented Breakfast at Tiffany's in the past without the kind of context that we would do now. In fact, we probably would not present the film at all now. But I wonder what your thoughts are about as you reflect back through Hollywood history. And there's certain moments where, they're just representations of Asian people just feel like, this is beyond the pale. We're not going to accept this anymore. What do you do with movies like Breakfast at Tiffany's now?
I think that it's still important to not just completely make it disappear, because it is absolutely a part of Hollywood history. And interestingly, I think the Truman Capote novel, the source material, doesn't have him as a buffoon. And, he's actually an artist. And so Hollywood chose to portray him as, Mickey Rooney is a comedic actor, right? He's a brilliant comedic actor. And I think for the longest time, he didn't see a problem with it. And I think later on, with all the social pressures, he admitted that maybe he shouldn't have done that. But the fact is, he served as comic relief in the movie, right? That the movie is actually kind of, it's supposed to be kind of light, but really, Audrey Hepburn is a call girl, and so is I can't remember her white male counterpart, but he the guy from A-Team.
George Papard.
George Papard, yes.
Yeah, George Papard.
Yes. George. I just said, I'm like, A-Team. But anyway, he's very much, they're both, trying to, life in New York really being exploited, and so it's not a light rom-com by any stretch of the imagination. And then you have someone like Mickey Rooney who comes in, who appears and is very much this silly character, and so many Asian Americans serve as the buffoon comic relief in the token films that they're in. We think of Long Duck Dong, and Pretty in Pink is kind of like the direct descendant, even though it's played by an Asian American actor, Gary. But and all of those, can be traced back to the original Yellow Faces, right? Where it's okay to other the Asian, right? Because that is the trope. That is, Asian is the other, is the comic buffoon. And so I think it's hard for Hollywood to take us seriously. And I think that points to what Elaine is saying. It makes it hard for people to take Asian Americans seriously in the general population, because all they've ever seen us are perpetual foreigners who can't speak English well, who are speaking broken English, who are speaking ridiculous accents, and of course, bumping into things. That was it was very much physical, like the kind of clumsy, which was just so weird, right? If you can't speak English, you must be clumsy, right? These kind of associations that actually expand beyond just, I mean, there's, Amos and Andy. I mean, there's, the person of color who is the buffoon is very much a trope in the United States. And I think with Asians, there's that cross section of the foreigner, right? Yeah. And then of course, the flip side, they could be the threat, the yellow peril. Mm-hmm. So all those are, again, like, these very extremes that somehow exist together, right? And so what do? We talk about it. We have to talk about it. We dissect it. We analyze it. We're doing what we're doing right now. We talk about the history of yellowface. We talk about actually expectations of Asian accents that Asian American actors have to grapple with today. They are actually asked to do accents in audition rooms based on these crazy accents that were invented by white actors in yellowface, right? So the very even idea of the foreign accent. I mean, I'm speaking with a California accent, and I hear you guys speaking in Canadian accents, right? So we're all accented. There's no one who speaks without an accent, but somehow we're Asian American actors to this day people that I follow on Twitter, they told me that they are still being asked to do foreign accents in auditions. It has not gone away. And so it's the legacy. We have to talk about the legacy and how it impacts how we are seen in the general world.
Well, that idea of an Asian character in an American movie having to have an accent, that idea of being perpetually foreign, seems to have been always a part of how Asians were represented in Hollywood cinema, and different than say anti-Black racist images in Hollywood cinema or anti-Indigenous racist images. You know, there's othering, but it's not that you're not even American. You can never be American because you're always foreign. And that seems to be something that's distinct to how Asians have been represented. I want to just bring up a still from Chinatown, which is another one of those films that is a legendary film in the canon of cinema. The very name of it, of course, refers to danger, mystery associated with Chinatowns in the US. And you've got a gardener character played by Jerry Fujikawa in the film. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this film and its representation of Chinese Americans in Chinatown as still being other and foreign.
Well, this scene is iconic, so iconic that even James Gandolfini cites it in an episode of The Sopranos, or did. Bad for the glass. The water is bad for the glass, which you could say is a slant pun on how accented Asians are supposed to talk. They can't say or, it comes out L, and L comes out an or. And some of the more kind of inventive critics have pointed out that in the way he solves the mystery before anyone else does, because he discovers Mulray's glasses that are broken, and kind of figures out the murder. But I think that Chinatown is just the very last line, also iconic. Forget her, Jake. It's Chinatown has got to be the most famous non sequitur in all of English language cinema, because what does that mean and what does that explain? But yes, the idea of Chinatown as this inscrutable place of forbidden pleasures and criminal activity, opium smoking, the idea of people living in cramped quarters because they like it like that, and you can get lost there. They're just tiny little alleys, which again sort of exonerates who actually, the architects of Chinatown, who put restrictions on how far they could build out and how far they could build up. In Vancouver, there were limits on the heights of buildings. So that's where the cheater floor came in, where they would try to create 2 floors out of 1, or create 3 floors out of 2. Anyway, but the idea that, oh, well, this is how Asians like to live. They like to live cramped together and in filth and with unpaved roads. So it's sort of the space where anything can happen. You can get lost. So you can forget her, Jake, and she can die, Faye Dunaway in Chinatown, and somehow fait accompli, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. There's another element in representation of Asian people in Hollywood cinema that's related to yellowface, but maybe a kind of a flip or an inversion, and that's a kind of a whitewashing that we've seen even very recently. I'm thinking of movies like Ghost in the Shell, of course, a Japanese anime film that was remade in live action with a big white Hollywood movie star in the lead role. I'm thinking of the Kung Fu TV series, where David Carradine ended up playing that lead role that had been meant for Bruce Lee. In the movie Doctor Strange, a character in the Marvel comic had been the Ancient One as an older Asian man, and was played by Tilda Swinton and reinvented as kind of a Celtic wise figure. And so there's a sense of kind of inhabiting Asianness, but from the perspective of white actors and white perspectives. And I wonder, Nancy, maybe I'll ask you to talk a little bit about that particular phenomenon.
So whitewashing is so common in the sense that, think about, I don't know, do Canadians celebrate Halloween?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so
On the same day.
I don't want to be so totally American-centric. So Halloween, if you go out into any store Halloween, the geisha outfits, the ninja, the kung fu master, those are costumes that anybody could put on. I mean, it is just so common to, I think, our Western culture to think of Asia as this this thing that we can co-opt, eat, and is fun and it's exotic and it makes you feel extra special, but then you can take it off and, not have to deal with it again. And so I think that whitewashing, it doesn't feel like problematic to Hollywood. I think it is more so now, but before, kind of more protests that arose out of, especially Ghost in the Shell, people just thought it was no big deal. And the excuse was always, well, there's no A-list actors to carry the film. And so if we think about historically, that was the Good Earth, right? Anime Wang wasn't seen as strong enough. And of course, the actress ended up winning best actress Oscar for it. There was actually more white actresses who have won Best Actress playing Asians than there's no Asian actress that has actually won a Best Actress Oscar. So this is the reality, right? So there's a history of seeing white actresses playing Asians and seen as, some sort of artistic achievement, right? And so we fast forward to the whitewashing. It's again the same kind of, we need an A-list actress to be in there to be able to carry the film. And of course, Ghost in the Shell didn't do well. It did not do well, and so that theory was debunked for that, and also the fact that people were not standing for whitewashing anymore. People said enough is enough. This is not okay, because there aren't even any roles for Asian women or Asian men and women. And then when they come up, you cast a white actor in it. And so it's a cyclical, right, problem where how can we ever establish ourselves if the only good roles are going to white actors? And so I think, but that was so recent. This is still happening.
I wanted to ask you both something else that I've noticed in a lot of movies and TV shows as well, which is a kind of erasure of Asians, which I guess is related to whitewashing in a way, but it's a different phenomenon maybe, that, movies that are set in Los Angeles or New York, where roughly 1 in every 7 or 1 in every 8 people is Asian. You don't see that, not in the main characters, not in the background. They're just off screen. What does that do to the lives of real Asian people in the world if you're not even seeing yourself represented in places where you are?
Well, research shows that for young people, especially young people of color, if they're not seeing themselves, their self-esteems are absolutely, deflated, right? And the kind of saying, you can't be what you can't see. And so not seeing yourself, at all in terms of the erasure you mentioned, or if you are on screen, you are the sidekick, which is also another phenomenon, the Asian sidekick. You think about, Big Trouble in Little China, right? The Asian sidekick or the Asian villain. Everybody, it's like the set dressing, right, that surrounds the white male hero. And so one psychological study that looked at, it was specifically Black boys and girls and white boys and girls, for every additional hour of television watched, Black boys and girls and white girls, their self-esteems went down, whereas white boys' self-esteems went up, right? Because who are the heroes? Who are the leads? Who does the story matter for, right? And it's always the white male leads. And so for Asian Americans who aren't even in that study, who aren't even on screen very much, it is I mean, I felt this when I was a young immigrant to the United States. I immigrated to Southern California, and then all the shows about Southern California looked nothing like the area that I was in. I had a very diverse set of friends, but all the TV shows, the movies, it was completely whitewashed, if you will. And so it makes you feel like you don't matter, for Asian Americans, that you don't matter. I think Stephen Yuen saying, is being Asian American, always thinking about everybody else, but nobody thinks about you. Right. And that, I mean, for so many people on social media, that hit home. We're always thinking about everyone else, but no one knows us. Like, even on my own campus, I feel like I'm invisible. Invisibility is a way of life for Asian Americans in this society, no matter how, I mean, I'm a pretty loud person. I'm pretty, I crack a lot of jokes, but it doesn't matter, right? Because I'm just another Asian face. And I think that Hollywood has a responsibility in that.
There has been resistance to all of these very negative, damaging stereotypes all the way along. There have been Asian American filmmakers, Asian Canadian filmmakers making films since almost the beginning of cinema. I want to ask you about that thread, about the artists who were working against stereotypes, telling their own stories, going back to the film The Curse of the Quan Guan in 1916, through the surge of Asian American filmmaking in the 80s and 90s, with films like Wang's Chan is Missing, like Who Killed Vincent Chin, by Christine Choi and Renee Tajima. And then up to today's films, the half of it, Alice Wu, Minari, Lulu Wang's work. There's so much great work happening now that is it countering all of these other elements that we've been talking about, the erasure, the stereotypes, the racist images? How is that thread of Asian American and Asian Canadian filmmaking changing how we think about representation?
I think that Nancy put it really well. If you can't be it if you don't see it. So just the exposure by itself, and having Asian characters who might not have accents, like the kids in Minari who speak Korean fluently, but also speak English without accents. Interesting thing is no one in that family really experiences blatant racism of any kind. And I think those stories where Asians are part of, they are very rare, but I think of in Canada a show like Schitt's Creek that had this tiny town called Schitt's Creek, and people of every ethnicity and race there. I mean, being 2S LGBTQA plus, is not a big deal, and getting married to men, not a big deal. But I also noticed that the Asians didn't have any lines. They never had any bit parts in there. So there's this issue about how Asian performers get to be A-list, right? Let's go back to what Nancy was saying, if they're not cast. So it's imperative that more Asian filmmakers put our stories out there and cast and just show this wider range of Asian North American experience. And
Elaine, you wrote a book. You wrote a book about Asian Canadian filmmakers in honor of the Real Asian Film Festival. And there have been many filmmakers here, Mina Shum, Helen Lee, so many others. Can you talk a little bit about just that movement, which as far as I know, started in the late 80s?
Yeah, and if we can make it also to include the US, because a movie like Chan is Missing that came out in, I think, 1982, which was actually the same year that Vincent Chin was murdered in Detroit, and these two guys with a baseball bat said, "It's because of you, mofos, that we're losing our jobs." So, there's no way to kind of make it monolithic or uniform. And I think the sheer diversity of Asian North American experience maybe makes it difficult for us to say this is Asian Canadian cinema or this is Asian American cinema, when in Canada, Cameron, that are great filmmakers of Asian descent. they cover all kinds of genres and styles, experimental, documentary, feature. But, I had a really bad experience actually teaching Chan is Missing at Stanford when I was a grad student there, because the predominantly white students didn't know how to read it. They didn't think it was conscious at all. Again, it was laminating the figure of the Asian male as buffoon onto what they were seeing. And I had left my class alone, where I went to my office, and a Chinese American student from Iowa came to my office in tears because she said they used every racial slur and walked out. And so a lot of it is like not to make it monolithic in Asian North American cinema or, media culture, but also educating people how to watch this stuff. And I feel like, the protests on Ghost in the Shell did some good. And the reception of Minari, I think, says something about maybe that things are moving in a better direction. But Canada, Mina Shum, Julia Kwan actually told an interesting story about how she wanted to do another story about Chinese Canadian life. And some of the big shots, in position to actually finance the film, said, no, we don't want another double happiness. So that's an issue that, who gets to celebrate themselves and pat themselves on the back for being so tolerant and welcoming diversity, and when does it constrict? So, I just have a lot of faith in independent, creatives, and the fact that filmmaking is so much less expensive now. And I just, fingers crossed. And
Nancy, this is the week when we've seen the launch of the trailer for Shang-Chi, directed by Destil Daniel Cretton and starring Canada's own Simu Liu. And it's one of a number of films that are quite high profile, mainstream commercial films with Asian leads that are coming down the pipe. Does that give you hope, or how do you think that fits within the overall landscape we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I think with independent films, so many of the Asian American independent films, even from all the way from The Curse of Guangguan, that these are films that are based on the filmmakers' own lives, right? So there's this authenticity in terms of writer-directors creating and casting themselves even, and so very much a place of truth that's coming out of lived experience, that's about Asian Americans and starring Asian Americans, and I think for Asian Americans and beyond, right? But certainly it is speaking to the Asian American audience, and I think that there's universality in the specificity, right? And then you have something like Shang-Chi, where the source material is a Marvel Comics, and it's not an Asian American writer. In fact, if we're talking about Fu Manchu, if you didn't know, Shang-Chi is the son of Fu Manchu. So,
I did not know that.
Yes,
I didn't know that.
You guys didn't know that? Yeah. Well, they've made him the Mandarin instead, and they cast Tony Leung in it, who is, I think the favorite of everyone in the film. And that is clever because Tony Leung is bigger than life as a international cinematic star. So to put him as the villain, at least I feel like it's guaranteed that he's not going to be one-dimensional, right? Because of who he is.
Young. Yes.
And he wouldn't accept a role. Why would he even bother, right?
Yeah.
And he's been in everything that is beautiful and perfect. And so, but it's Fu Manchu / the Mandarin, right? That is the source material. So it is it's cringy. It's cringy, right? And even seeing I thought the trailer was fantastic. But there is this kind of like, I think there are camps in the Asian American community is like kung fu is enough kung fu, right? Because we're not just, because a lot of us have been made fun of, like, do you know kung fu? Are your hands registered weapons? I mean, it's a little bit, it's better than like, you're the nerd, you're the emasculated person, but it's just another stereotype, right? But then there are those who are like, no, let's reclaim kung fu. It's empowering, and let's not let another Iron Fist happen where, you know, you have, or Last Samurai, right? Where you have this kind of story of the white male savior who goes for a weekend in Asia and comes back like the Last Samurai or the Kung Fu master, right? And it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, but that is how these stories go. And so to have Shang-Chi, to have Simu Liu, embody this, you know, this superhero, right? He is a superhero. Shang-Chi is a superhero. And so it's still like, I still got chills watching the trailer, right? Feeling like, okay, we need this, right? We've had, I know, so many white male superheroes. And we need an Asian American superhero, because I'm watching these Avengers movies looking for the one Asian. They like come on like 1 second and then they're gone, right? In Doctor Strange, where the entire movie takes place in or most of the movie takes place in Tibet, this whole fake Celtic thing, it made no sense whatsoever. And there's like, you know, one Asian dude, right? Who's again on for a split second. And Benedict Wong is a great actor. He's fantastic. You know, what a waste of talent, right? He should be Doctor Strange. That's what I'm thinking, right? But that's, you know, unfortunately, I'm not casting for Marvel. But here's Shang-Chi. Here we finally have somebody. And so this is what Hollywood is doing. This is where all the money is, right? All the money is going to these Marvel movies, all the interest, all the toys, and, you know, because these are kid movies too, right? So kids need, you know, to be able to play with Shang-Chi and not always, you know, play with a toy for Asian American kids, not, you know, that doesn't look like them. So it's bigger than just kind of like Marvel movie. It's huge. It's global, right? And so I hope and pray that it will do well. But they hired, you know, Desta Creighton, who is Asian American, right? So there's that going for it. And I think that he's very much aware of, I don't actually envy him, right? He's given this big budget. It's his first big budget film. And he has to, you know, make sure it's not racist, even though the source material is racist. He has to make sure that he's, you know, pleasing the Asian market and the US market, because we saw how Mulan didn't really do that very well. So there's so many asks, right? No, like, come on, like white directors don't have all this burden on them, right? It's like poor Asian American directors have to, like, you know, they have to weather so much. And as well as Simu Liu, the actors too, they're under a lot of scrutiny because they're the first. If you're the first, you have to redeem every stereotype that has come before you, right? I mean, it's not fair, but those are the expectations, I think.
The reality.
Yes.
The last thing I want to ask both of you is, given everything we've talked about and the long history of inaccurate representation of Asian people on the big screen and on the small screen, why does accurate representation on screen matter in the real world when it comes to how we view Asian people, Asian Americans, Asian Canadians, Asian people generally?
So there's this theory called contact theory, that if you don't know anybody from a certain group, then all of your ideas of that group, or so many of it, comes from popular culture and media, right? It's subconscious, right? So it's like, if I don't know another Asian, I'm watching media for those impressions. And so if we only have negative, and especially the foreigner, perpetual foreigner stereotypes, then that's how Asians are being perceived in Western society. And we know that's very dangerous. It's the uptick in anti-Asian violence is scary. And unfortunately, yeah, we see that a lot of it is coming out of Hollywood. And so it's more important than ever.
Thank you. And Elaine?
Yeah, I agree completely. And there was a study done, I think some faculty of education did a kind of study of how elementary school students, this is somewhere in the US, were treated according to race and ethnicity. And they found that and this echoes something that Nancy had said earlier, that white boys were systematically rewarded for speaking up and, being brave. And Asian students of both genders were systematically rewarded for being quiet. They were seen, if they spoke, as being too loud, and in a way, again, it's an image laminating itself onto people. Like, we're used to you being stoical, and you suffer in silence, and you have your Confucian or Buddhist beliefs, and you just weather these things, and you don't talk about them, you don't complain. And so it works to reinforce a silencing of us. And then that goes for silencing our stories and silencing the multiplicity, the plurality of Asian diasporic and Asian North American experience. And I agree with Nancy completely. Universality is in the specifics. And, I didn't know that Arkansas swampland was so great for growing minari, the vegetable in the movie. And I wouldn't have, thought of that. Or even that movie got me thinking about, how is it that I get my gochujang at the supermarket down the street? That's the Korean red chili pepper. Or the people were thinking about this. They were thinking about, how do we feed new immigrants? That's a cool story. It might not be glamorous, it might not be super heroic, but it's a story that needs to be told, and its accuracy or authenticity comes from that place of, we're here, we talk, we do things, we're very different. I mean, as a professor, I'm so lucky that during this pandemic, I've been able to work at home, and I've been so worried about it. But, the silencing thing works in the broader culture too, in that even though there's been this huge uptick in reports of violent attacks on Asians in the US, it's, I guess, gone up 150%. And in Canada, it was like 1,150 reported incidents. We know those are low figures. And if we don't see ourselves and our stories on screen, and other people are not giving, a crap about, how we live and what's important and how we make meaning out of our lives, then that silence is just going to continue. And a denial that these events actually occur.
Dr. Elaine Chang, Dr. Nancy Wang Yuen, thank you both so much for shedding light on this. I really appreciate it. It's been a wonderful conversation.